Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's second session with Ollie. Ollie, you all right? How you doing? Have you had a nice lunch? Very quick lunch.
I was busy responding to emails. I didn't actually get a lunch break. I mean, I don't want to, have the world's smallest violin playing for me, Jake. But no, that's all good. I had a wonderful break. Thank you very much, and quite a few nice comments from people who joined our talk this morning. So
good to hear.
All good. So shall I just plough straight on, do you think?
Yeah, just get cracking. Any questions, guys, on YouTube or on Discord, just let us know and we'll get round to them at some point. But otherwise, mate, crack on.
Beautiful. Wonderful. Thank you, Jake. So, hello, everybody. I am going to be drilling down on a few different topics today. I've kind of collectively called this presentation color theory. It's not quite the best description of it, but it's a result of 15 odd years of training people in production and post-production, and a kind of a response to all of the various little bits and pieces that people tend to sort of have half a knowledge about, but not necessarily know everything about, little bits and pieces that I think are really important as underpinnings, really, to what we do as filmmakers, whether it's as a DOP or as a director or a producer, or if you're an editor, colorist, or a bit of everything. I think these things really help with the entire process. And one of the big things is once you have a grasp, I think, of these concepts and some of these things we're going to be talking about, it really frees you up to kind of get the best image quality you can out of the camera, and then spend your time in post-production really developing and supporting your narrative rather than putting out fires and trying to fix problems that have crept in earlier on. So there's a number of things that we're going to touch on. Nothing in a stupid amount of detail, but hopefully a lot of things in enough detail to make you kind of think, oh, I never realized what that was about. But really, I think the questions at the end are going to be most important. So I'm going to be touching on so much, and as is my way, talking without many breaths for the next hour and a half, and so the best way to interject is via Discord or YouTube with some questions, and I'll do my best to answer either as we go or at the end. So then, where to begin? I've decided to begin with clearing up any potential confusion between the different worlds that we occupy. We straddle two different color models as human beings every single day. Anytime that we're looking at print, anytime we're looking at magazines, newspapers, photos that are printed out or on posters or billboards, anything where oh my goodness, someone's just said they love the audio on this stream. That is the first time I've not had someone complain about the audio. I'm very pleased to hear that. Thank you very much for posting that. It's reassuring. So every time we're seeing light hitting a surface and bouncing off that, and that light entering our eyeballs, we're talking about a subtractive color model. So paint, print, anything like that. And the reason I mention that is only to highlight how it is the complete and utter opposite of what we have to think about with video when we're talking about transmissive light, about sunlight, about screens giving off their own colors. The subtractive color model is the exact opposite. So cyan, magenta, and yellow, which are the secondary colors in our additive color model, are the primary colors in a subtractive color model, RGB being the secondaries. And when you mix it all together, you're moving towards black. As I say, I am only mentioning that to make sure that we are all very clear that we are talking about additive color model when we're talking about video, where we have red, green, and blue as our primaries, yellow, magenta, and cyan as our secondaries, and quite crucially, a perfect mix of all of them, equal amounts of all of them, gives us white light. And that is quite a basic and important concept in color. Someone's furiously brushing the pathway outside of my studio. I'm just going to go and shut the window. Just give me 2 seconds. Sorry about that. Doing some gardening outside out the window, which is lovely, but not whilst I'm live. Now, yes, so the additive color model. So this idea of mixing all of the different colors of our additive color model together, getting us to neutrality is a very important process. Everyone could just make sure they've muted their microphones, just so we can hear you in the background. That would be great. Thank you very much. Who is that? I'm getting a bit of doubling back here, Jake. Where's that coming from?
Make sure they've muted their microphones.
You see if everyone can make sure that they've got their mics muted. Sorry, just so that we don't get a feeding back, a duplication. Okay, so another foundation, sort of foundation thing that we need to talk about when we're talking about color is the color wheel. The color wheel is something that we're used to seeing an awful lot. It's there in our NLE and it's popping up all the time, and it's very easy for us to just kind of assume we know what we're doing with it. But actually, I think a lot of people, if they're honest, if they're new to the color wheel, they just tend to just click in the middle of it and drag around and hope for the best. The color wheel is actually showing us some very specific information. So building on what we were just talking about in terms of additive color model, all of the various different frequencies of the rainbow all combining to giving us white light. What we're doing is we're actually taking with the color wheel, we're taking that linear scale of wavelengths, which is the reality of the way that light works. You have varying different lengths of wavelengths of light, and that's a linear scale from microwaves to infrared and through the visible part of the spectrum and beyond. And actually what the color wheel does is it breaks the laws of nature, because what it does is it takes one end, in this case red, and it takes the other end, blue, and it sort of spins itself round and connects the two together in a circle. And actually to bridge that gap, because that gap doesn't exist in reality, there is no meeting of infrared and ultraviolet. They're two different ends of the visible light spectrum. So what it does is it creates this magenta. If you look at that magenta on that color wheel, that's a lie. That doesn't exist in additive color model. It doesn't exist in light, but it is something that we produce to fill and close the gap when we convey colors as a color wheel. And what that's doing is that's enabling us to actually define hue as an angle, which is quite useful when we're trying to move through different changing hues. And I'm using the term hue because that's about as close as we get to a single term in color science that defines color, although really color and the word color isn't used in color science. The everyday use of the word color is really a combination of various different things which are defined individually in color science. So we have hue, we have intensity, we have saturation, we have lightness, we have all kinds of different terms that are used to describe a given sample or a patch. But hue is something that we measure in angles on a color wheel in 360 degrees, whereas any given hue's intensity or saturation is measured from the middle and out. So 0% saturation in the middle would be where we would find black, white, and grey. And then the outer edge of the color wheel would represent 100% intensity of a given hue. So if we imagine that this was a dartboard and we threw a dart at this color wheel, wherever that landed, that would be a combination of a hue value in angle and a saturation value in percentage, which together give us our chroma reference or chroma value, which is about as close as we get to color in this area. Now, color wheels are really useful, particularly when you're developing color palettes and when you're thinking about looks for films. And a really good place to start, if this is all kind of new to you, if you've not heard of additive color model, if you've not really used color wheels before, there's a really useful resource on Adobe's website, which is called Color, spelled the American way, .adobe.com. And it really helps you get an overview of the different types of color harmonies. So we've got analogous, monochromatic, triadic, complementary, split complementary, double split complementary, square, compound, shades, and then there's also a custom view that you can do here. If we take like a basic one like complementary, it allows us to select a hue or hue intensity and then see the complementary shades that go with that. And as you move them around, you can see other colors that work with them. So for example, if we had something green, the complementary color to that is magenta. In fact, any of you that have ever done any green screen work, chroma key, you will have probably used some kind of spill suppression, and you will notice that spill suppression is in fact magenta tint. And that tint of magenta, because it's the complementary color to green, it neutralizes where any green from the green screen has been bounced and is wrapping around your subject. So there's a really good demonstration there of exactly what we mean by complementary. They are colors that complement each other in as much as they balance each other out. The analogy I often use is Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. They are two different ends of the color wheel, two different ends of the force, but they balance each other out. And that's what we mean by complementary. They're not very polite. They don't come around for a cup of tea, but they do balance each other out. So if we added magenta to green, you'd actually end up with nothing. You'd end up in the middle, if you've got the balance right, and in the middle, if you remember, is 0%. So it's white. It's just pure luminance at that point. If we have a yellow tint in our video, we add blue. If we want to have the complementary color to skin tone, it's teal or these blues here. So we can start to actually understand how color palettes work. And complementary colors are really one of the most basic ways. Right at the end of this talk, I'll give you some visual demonstrations from some films that I love the color palettes that they've developed and how they work with them. One of the ones that we look at is Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, which uses a very straightforward but very effective complementary color palette in the film, and basically plays on exactly these sort of browny oranges and these tealy blues. So anyway, a really useful place to come. Triadic color schemes and how they work. You know, Joker's a really good example of a film that uses a modified triadic color palette. Yeah, all good to come here and get an idea of how colors work together and how you can come up with various combinations. So let's think more now about, if we've kind of touched on the basics of the additive color model and the color wheel, which are our main kind of ways of working and interacting with a digital video signal. But let's actually go back to where this all began, which is through the study of the human visual system. It's really important to understand how our eyes work in order to understand how digital imaging came about and the way it works. And so we're going to start off talking about the human visual system. Hang on, we've got a question here. Let me just double check. Can you talk about the color wheel cylinder, if you could please? Had it explained that way somewhere, and would like to have more clarity. I will come back to that one because that's going to involve a little bit more conversation. So let's look at the eye. Let's zoom in on the eye. There it is. Look, the way the human eye works is light comes in and at the back of the eye, very densely packed around the fovea, which is the area around the optic nerve at the back of the eye, we have cones. There are two different types of cells. So there's the cones and the rods. And the cones are the color receptors in our eyes. They're very densely packed around that middle area, so which actually is an important point. You have to be looking at something to truly see it. If we think of this as terms of like a sensor with pixel density, our highest level of pixel density is around the middle portion around the fovea of the eye, and that comes predominantly from the cones. The reason why that's relevant is, of course, that means that we're more or less colorblind in the periphery of our vision, and we actually rely on a lot of weirdness that our brain does to correct for that. I think most people are aware that because of the way that lenses work, that the image that our brain receives of the world is in fact upside down, and it's the brain that spins that the correct way around. But there's also other things like our brain will tell us the color of something in the periphery of our vision, even though it can't really see the color very clearly in the periphery of our vision. but it will tell us what it is if we've already looked at it. So if you look directly at something and look away, you'll still perceive that color because your brain actually fills in that blank for you. And it will also do it with objects which are known objects which you're used to seeing. If it's a truly unique object you've never seen before and you've never directly observed it with the middle portion of your eye, actually your brain doesn't know what color to render it. It's a very interesting function of the way our brain works. But these cones are split into 3 different types. There's short, medium, and long wavelength tuned cones. And the short wavelength ones are the ones looking at that sort of just under 400 to just past 500 nanometer area, which is the blue part of the spectrum. And you can see it's quite distinctly separated off from the other 2, the medium and long wavelength cones, which are predominantly peaking around green and then into the reds, and actually have quite a big spread. In fact, if you look at the green cones, which we have the most of, these are the medium wavelength cones, we don't have an equal amount of blue, green, and red. We don't have a third of each. It's quite a big disparity, actually. The most that we have are the greens, and they also cover the widest spread. Now, the rods, which are the monochromatic, but lumen-sensitive cells in our eyes, which are spread out around the periphery of our vision, these cover actually quite a wide spectrum, but they're not perceiving color. They're monochromatic in nature, so it's not actually determining color values from those. But these rods and also the green cones, because they cover such a large range, these are how we're actually perceiving luminance and how we're essentially multiplying and adding all of these different bits of information together to tell us how bright a scene is. But there's a big overlap you can see there between green and red. Now, as I say, there isn't an equal spread of these cones. If we actually combine all of the various different cones together and look at their the color sensitivity together, you'll notice that there's a very big spike in green. Drops off towards reds quite nicely, but there's a very severe drop off towards those blues. And the reason for that is actually only 1% of the cones in our eye are those short or blue wavelength cones. The reason for that is because we've evolved to pay little attention to blues, because there's very little flora and fauna around us that are blue. And in fact, there's a dominance of blue in the sky, which is a kind of like white noise. We tune it out. The sky is kind of irrelevant to us from an evolutionary scale. We can't procreate with the sky, and we can't eat it, and it's not going to eat us. So it's actually something that we've tuned out. We've evolved to pay little attention to blues. Conversely, greens, we've evolved to pay a lot of attention to greens. The peak spectral irradiance of the sun is in that medium frequency there, but sort of 550 nanometers. So the most amount of energy comes from the sun in that part of the wavelength. And because of that, chlorophyll has developed to be that color so that plants can convert the maximum amount of energy from the sun to starch and to energy. And because chlorophyll is that color, foliage is that color, and the environment in which we've, on an evolutionary scale, evolved is dominated by those greens. And sensitivity to shades of green gives us increased perception of movement, of contrast changes, and sort of hunting and gathering in those environments. It's therefore an advantage. So the way we're perceiving the world is very interesting, because that directly affects the way that our RGB signaling was developed and the way that our ideas around luminance and color processing feed into the way that everything that we work with works. And a good way of demonstrating that is a simple illustration here. This is a red, green, and blue patch here, and the simple question there, which is brighter? I think most people would look at that and probably plumb with green. They'd probably say that green looks slightly brighter than the others. It's a bit of a close call between red and green there. I think most people would place blue somewhere behind. It is sort of darker. I think the key thing is you wouldn't necessarily look at that blue and say it's considerably darker than the green or the red. But what's interesting is because of the way that the signal is processed, which mimics the way the eye works, we actually, if we look at this same patch on a waveform, you can see that the green is actually at 72 IRE and the blue is right down at 7. So as I say, our signal processing for digital imaging systems has developed to mimic the way that we process color information with our eyes, deliberately so that these appear to be almost roughly the same brightness because of the way that our eyes work. We can also look at the way that color gamuts, color spaces evolve. This is here known as CIE 1931 XYZ, and this is a very famous color gamut, because this is the colors that our eyes can see. And what's very useful about this is to then plot on top of it the color spaces that are used in our imaging devices. So a Rec 709 color space, which is essentially based on the sRGB color space, is only 35% coverage of CIE 1931 XYZ. So we can only display with the vast majority of our display devices about 35% of what the eyes can see. With an 8-bit signal, that's about 17 million possible colors. But Rec 2020, which is the kind of the standard that we're moving inexorably towards, is interesting because it allows for up to 12 bits. That's up to 68 billion possible colors. And that would 12-bit signal is 4,096 shades per color channel, which gives us a huge amount of granular control over colors. Definitely no banding there, but more importantly, it covers 75% of what our eye can see. If we look at the red point, for example, I mean the greens are clearly much higher. I mean, anyone shooting natural history is going to love Rec 2020. But if we look at the reds, which I think are quite relevant, if we look at the red in Rec 709, see where that terminates. That's the bottom right corner of the triangle, and look how that shifts. And is actually relatively quite orange compared to a proper red that we can see. And in fact, Rec 2020's red is very similar. It's not far off the P3 red as well. So you'll often find reds look actually red in the cinema when you're watching films that use a P3 gamut. And as we move forwards into Rec 2020, reds are going to look so much more red than they currently do. A Rec 709 red is actually quite orange. So digital imaging systems have been developed over time and almost always and almost exclusively with the purpose of mimicking the way the way our eyes work. Right from the early part, so late 19th century, early 20th century, where a lot of this research into the human visual system was being formalized and then taken and learnt from for how our digital imaging systems work. If we, for example, look at the way that a CMOS sensor works, CMOS sensors are natively monochromatic. They're colorblind. They work by photons of light hitting them, and they generate a charge. And that charge is a linear charge, and it's also at its most basic level, those photosites are monochromatic. So they're responding linearly to light as they hit them, and they're colorblind. So they have to respond on a couple of key things happening to the signal in order to give us a viewable image. In terms of the color side of things, that revolves around what's known as a color filter array. So a guy called Bryce Baer, who worked for Kodak at the time, I think this was late 70s. He came up with the CFA, the color filter array, which is a very simple way of applying a mosaic filter over the top of the photosites, so that as the light passes through, instead of the photosites just registering voltage across all spectrums and essentially giving you a black and white image, you can then apply an algorithm that says, well, actually at that photosite it was covered by a red or a green or a blue filter, and so actually we're being able to interpret from that the intensity of red wavelengths or green wavelengths or blue wavelengths at those specific photosites. Now, the world around us, of course, isn't either one of those three things, and just like the way that the eye works, it has to go through a post process, an opponent process stage, as it's known in the human visual system, where ganglion cells and other secondary cells actually essentially extrapolate what colors look like from the initial phase. And it's the same with computer and digital imaging. We're taking these values, and an algorithm is debayering or demosaicing the image and inferring what colors must have been there from what it knows about the intensity of light at these specific values. You'll also notice that there's twice as many green mosaic filters as there are red and blue. And again, this is an attempt to mimic the way that the eyes work with the increased sensitivity in those parts of the spectrum. And it's taking most of the luminance and the Y component, therefore, from that those green sections. So once you are demosaicing or debayering that image, undoing Bryce Baer's work, what you're left with is a color picture, and that's a full color picture with full RGB information that you may or may not then have encoded into a form of compressed format at the end. One of the ways that you may or may not do that, or the camera may or may not do that, is in terms of the bit depth, which we just touched on briefly there, which is how many shades of each color channel there are, and therefore the more choice you have in terms of the color palette that you can reproduce. The smaller the bit depth, the less shades of colors that you can produce, and the less subtlety that you can render colors from one to the other. And the sunset's classically the one that's used to demonstrate banding. So in an 8-bit signal, you get banding in subtle changes of hue and color across something like a sky, because you get to like the perimeter of a band and it goes, okay, this is now significantly different enough from where I am to be the next color I can produce. And because there are so few colors relatively, those bands become quite wide, because it's for a whole one of those bands, it's like it's this color, and then okay, now it's significantly different enough for me to move to the next color. Whereas in 10, 12 and so on, those bands are closer together because it has more subtle changes. I often liken it to a pack of Crayola. If you have those small little kind of pack of 12 Crayola, you might have full of 4 different colors in there and a couple of different variations between the two. Whereas if you have one of those bumper, like massive 1,000 Crayola packs, and you've got lots and lots of subtle variation between different blues and oranges and so on and so forth. And so an increased bit depth give us essentially more colors that we can paint our picture with. Now, the other thing that it's doing, I said there that the sensors are natively monochromatic. That's how we're dealing with that issue. They're also natively linear, so they're responding linearly to light. But that isn't how our eyes work. So from early on, and we're really talking like the 20s, 30s, where people like Marconi were working on developing imaging systems, electronic cameras. We're really looking at ways of how can we get the tonal response, the contrast response with imaging to more closely mimic the way that the eye works. Now, gamma is a purely mathematical term. It means a power, a transform that's being applied. And what it's in this case being applied to is that linear response of the sensor. So in cameras, when it's recording light, it's natively seeing that linearly, and it's having a gamma adjustment applied to it right early on in the chain at the point where it's converted from analog to digital. And it's actually having that gamma applied in order to respread its sensitivity to light and redistribute that tonal range to more closely mimic the logarithmic nature of our eyes. And what that results in is an increased amount of contrast and information in mid-tone and shadow areas, because we're actually very, very good at seeing information in low light areas and shadow and lower mid-tone areas at the expense of highlight information, because we're less sensitive to highlight information ourselves. So by mimicking that, we're ending up with a more realistic image, and it's also making the most of the signal that it's processing. And the gamma adjustment that's applied in camera is then inverted by the display device to then essentially linearize and create the image that we see at the other end. In terms of gamuts, most cameras actually can record much bigger gamuts than our display devices. In terms of display devices, we're mostly working in a BT709, so we're working with a relatively reduced color gamut compared to what our eye can see. But actually, most cameras now can record much bigger gamuts. For example, here you can see Canon Cinema gamut, which is available in C200, C300, C500, C700. The Canon Cinema gamut far exceeds what we can see with our eyes, as does red wide gamut RGB and many, many others as well. The idea behind that is that by capturing more than you need, you can then scale down from there. The worst thing would be if you captured too small and then tried to go up from there. You can't make up information where it wasn't there to begin with. So the idea of shooting a large gamut, and in fact, what you would have if you were shooting RAW, on a Canon camera, for example, if you're shooting RAW, you'd have that Canon Cinema gamut available to you, and you can work down from there. The same approach is used when you're grading. If you've got an HDR deliverable, you would do that first, because you're working with the largest color palette first, and then you'd come down from there. You couldn't go the other way. Another thing that's done in terms of color processing is obviously there's a need to manage data sizes, and chroma subsampling is one of the techniques that can potentially be used by the camera to save data, and it's done at the expense of color fidelity. It's not done at the expense of luma, the luminance component here. The Y component is actually left alone because we're incredibly sensitive to contrast, and we don't want to make any compromises there, whereas we're less sensitive to color changes, and so we can actually chuck away a surprising amount of information. Chroma subsampling is where you've probably seen these 444, 422, 420 things before, and you may well have heard these numbers but don't necessarily know what they're saying to you. If we stick to the three main ones, so 444, 422, 420, they all start with a 4. The reason they all start with a 4 is because when we're looking at chroma subsampling, you're looking at a sample size that is 4 wide. And so because that is the same with all of these, the first number is always going to be a 4. The key thing is then how many samples in that 4 wide by 2 deep are you keeping in when you're subsampling, when you're taking away color information. So if it's 444, your sample of 4 wide, you're keeping four chroma values in the top line and 4 chroma values in the next line down. In other words, it's just another way of saying you're not doing anything. There's no subsampling going on. 444 is just another way of saying full RGB, and it's not compressing the color information in that way at all. 422, in a sample 4 wide, in the top row of 4, you keep 2 bits of chroma values, and in the next row you also keep 2 for every sample 4 wide. So it's 4 wide, keeping 2 in the top, 2 in the bottom, and what that means is you essentially have chucked away half your color information. The reason it can get away with that is because of the amount of color information that's there, and increased resolution helps with this massively, because what it does is it shares the color information from its neighbor. You obviously can't have an image that's half chromatic, half monochromatic. So what it's doing is it's saying, well, let's take the chroma value from the pixel on the left here, and let's duplicate that. And you're storing that information mathematically, just saying at the point of rendering that on screen, it's saying, right, I'm sharing you. So that's essentially being described mathematically. You don't have to store that information, and you're essentially saving 50% of your color space there. In 420, which is the next most common one, you can see that is half again. So there's half as many chroma values in the next one down. So it's a sample 4 wide, again, hence the 4 at the beginning. And in the top row, it's the same as 422. It's 2 kept in the top row. The important difference here is that the next row, everything's taken away. Now, the reason it does that is to save yet more color information, and it does that by sharing the chroma value of that first pixel between those 3 around it. So essentially you end up with groups of 4, and that square is actually quite common in both chroma subsampling but also spatial compression as well. This idea of averaging or borrowing color information from blocks or groups of pixels. They call them in spatial compression then as macro blocks, but they're essentially, that blocking is something that you can start to see. So the key thing to remember is you have all your color information in 444, half the color information in 422, and only 25% of the color information you started with in 420. So you can imagine a compressed codec where it's 8-bit, and then from that 8-bit image it's then subsampling, and then maybe it's spatially compressing, let alone things like temporal compression as well. These are all techniques that are used to shrink the data of the data size down of the video, but all at the expense of wiggle room afterwards. And I always think it's such an irony, and a cruel irony of film production, that the types of cameras that are doing 8-bit, 420, spatially compressed, temporally compressed, are often the cameras that are cheapest, and therefore most likely to be in the hands of the least experienced operators, and they therefore have the hardest job to actually get an image that requires as little adjustment as possible. Bear in mind also, if you've got a camera that's 8-bit 420 codec and you're also then shooting log, you are expecting a huge amount from that codec in order to be able to pull that information and pull that image back to where it should be, to linearize it, to make it essentially graded and that's just neutralizing it, let alone them any kind of creative look. So if you are sat there with a camera, I had a question after the last one with someone with an A7 III, an A7R2 as well, asking about how they're often disappointed with the look and the colors from their film. You're asking so much of cameras like that, particularly mirrorless cameras that are shooting into these compressed codecs. There's very little information left behind, which just puts huge emphasis on you getting it absolutely bang on in camera. Understanding how we can kind of see this information is also very, very relevant as well. Sorry, someone's asking, Kate is asking if there's a way to increase the size. They're really small. Okay. It's filling my whole screen, I'm afraid, Kate. So I can't make them physically any larger my side, I'm afraid. So yeah, sorry about that. I don't know. I'm not sure what I can do.
I think it's because of because you're using an ultra wide. If you go onto the YouTube stream, I've zoomed in on OBS, so you should be able to get a larger view of it there.
I apologize. Yeah, I've got an ultra wide monitor.
It's all good.
So it might be appearing quite small on my screen. It's huge. Yeah, so understanding how these how scopes can help us is really important. You've got to remember with scopes, the thing that they're giving us, which is so imperative in terms of post-production with video signaling, is it's giving us a completely unbiased opinion on the chroma and luma values of the pixels in our image. Our brains do all kinds of weird things. Our eyes do all kinds of weird things. You might be colorblind and not realize it. You might, who truly knows that we all perceive colors in exactly the same way? There's literally no way to test for that. So what's fantastic about scopes is they allow you to quantify in a completely impartial way the information that's up on screen. Most basic type of scope we have is a histogram. It's literally a bar graph. It will look across the whole image, and it will start off looking for pixels that have a value of 0. So we're looking at a simple IRE scale here, 0 being black, 100 being white. In an 8-bit RGB signal, that would be the equivalent of 000 for black, and 100 would be 235, 235, 235 for a broadcast white. And a super white would be, in an 8-bit signal, would be 255, 255, 255. In 10-bit, that would be 1024, and in 12-bit, that would be 4096, and so on and so on. The important thing there being that the histogram is looking across the image, counting how many black pixels it can find, and saying, oh, okay, there's X amount of black pixels, and it stacks them up in a bar graph. It'll then move on to 1 and 2 and so many different values, and it's just stacking them up. It's nowhere near as useful as a luma waveform. A luma waveform takes advantage of a y-axis to do something a little bit more useful. So it actually spins the histogram on its side. The y-axis becomes what was the x-axis in the histogram, and that frees up the x-axis in a waveform luma scope to actually plot these values from left to right where they appear left to right in your frame. So, for example, in this shot, you can see there's this big barrel on the right of frame there. I'm not referring to Andrew, bless him. I'm doing the barrel next to him. And that barrel has a white sticker on it. And if you look, that's about 2/3 of the way across from the left to the right of the screen. And if we look at the scopes, 2/3 across from the left to the right, you'll see there's this object that's coincidentally about as wide as that barrel is on the frame. And of course, it is the barrel. That's why it's the same width. It's exactly the same. We're plotting and we can find things. You can see that it's made up of a light object that's sitting at around about sort of 80 IRE. And then if we follow down beneath it, there's like a darker band as well, which is around about 40 IRE. And what we're looking at there is the white label stuck onto the wood. And we can actually see those things. And the reason why that's so useful to be able to actually find things easily in these scopes is once you can find something, you can then place it somewhere else. So let's, this is a graded image, but let's say that this was shot log. If we know where black is and we know where white should be and we know what the whitest thing is, we can start to intelligently find those objects in the frame and place them when we're color grading. So a luma waveform is a very useful way for visualizing the spread of contrast in our image. When it comes to color, the RGB overlay is actually taking what we've just seen with the luma waveform. It's exactly the same, but it's actually plotting the red, green, and blue components separately on top of each other. Where that's really useful is a very simple idea, which is that where you have equal amounts of red, green, and blue, so 0, 0, 0 being black, 235, 235, 235 being broadcast white, and any equal amounts of red, green, and blue, you have black, white, or grey. What's really useful with an overlay is it actually will make the scopes go white, the traces go white, when they are representing pixels that are equal amounts of red, green, and blue. So for example, you can see there's lots of black in this image, and if we look at the bottom near 0 on the waveform, we can see there's lots of white traces. That very quickly shows me that the black objects in this frame are actually black. If they weren't, they wouldn't be white, they would be separated, and you would see the color channels split apart. For example, like you do on the wooden barrel there, the color of the wood, it's obviously not white, gray, or black, it's wood colored, and therefore the red channel is higher, then there's the green channel, and then there's the blue channel, and you can see them split apart there on the wood of the barrel, and you can see that also on the left hand side. Another thing you can see here is that white label that's on the barrel, which is higher up the waveform at around about 80 IRE. You can see that it's basically yellow, and we can see that because the red and green channels are almost equal, and then blue's behind. Equal amounts of red and green is yellow. Equal amounts of blue and green would be cyan. Equal amounts of blue and red would be magenta. So if we've got an almost equal amount of red and green, and then blue falling behind there, that shows us that white label is in fact not white at all. And this is why it's so important, because of the way that the vision works. Our brain is constantly internally kind of white balancing for what we're seeing. And so if we had the image, the video filling the screen without the scopes, very quickly our eyes would actually find those areas of brightness. So it'd find that white label, for example, in this shot, and it would actually start neutralizing the image based on that being the white point. And our brain would essentially auto white balance that to make it look white. Whereas the scopes actually reveal the truth. They're completely impartial, and they reveal to us that, in fact, that is a yellow label. If that's a problem, we can deal with it. If it's not, it doesn't matter. But it's a really important part of bridging the gap between the way that the human visual system works and the way that digital imaging works. This is the RGB parade, which is showing the same information as we've just seen, but instead of overlaying it all on top of each other, it's just squeezing them up next to each other, so you've got them side by side. Sometimes it's useful to use this approach. Again, you can see the label with the blue channel further down, then the green, then the red. Sometimes seeing them side by side like this can be helpful for identifying tints. But these days, I have to say, I use the overlay most of the time. Vector scopes are basically color wheels. So if we think back to our color wheel that we were looking right at the beginning there, you can see we've got our red, magenta, blue, cyan, green, yellow, plotted round, all in the same places that we saw on the color wheel earlier. And a vector scope is simply plotting the pixels on that color wheel, showing you where they fall. So in other words, their color, and not just their color, not remember their hue as an angle, and then their intensity or saturation by how far out from the middle they are. So this actually shows that this is a relatively desaturated image. There's the most saturated thing is the beer in the glass, and you can see a very thin little spike off towards yellow. It's kind of over one side of the flesh tone line, which is that line heading up between red and yellow, and we can see the pixels that represent the skin. You can also see that it turns out oak barrels are almost exactly the same color as skin. So this revealing information about the hue and saturation of the pixels in our image, and this becomes incredibly useful when doing things like color matching. If we see cut to the next shot and there's another glass and some beer in that glass, and we can see that the angle, the hue angle of that is different to the spike that we can see here, then we know that there's a change, something's different, and we can correct for that. Again, being able to identify it on the scopes makes it easy for us to correct or adjust afterwards. Now, we always balance contrast first because we're so much more sensitive to contrast than we are color. So it's really important when you're thinking about color and post-production that and production, to be honest, when you're lighting as well, it's really important to think and prioritize contrast always. We're so much more perceptive of changes to contrast. It's an incredibly important part of the image that we see at the end. And color actually just pains me to say it as a colorist, but color is actually relatively far behind in terms of our contrast sensitivity. So we'd always deal with contrast first, and we tend to use things that generally in NLEs are referred to as shadows, midtones, and highlights, but actually specifically what they're talking about, which is dictated by the zones of influence, so the roll-off between these controls. Most of the time what they're talking about are actually lift, gamma, and gain. Lift is where we're lifting the black point, and as you can see with this graph, there's actually a big roll-off when you adjust when a lift adjustment is made. You're adjusting the black point predominantly, but there's actually an effect all the way up to the white point. When you're adjusting gain, you're predominantly affecting the white point, but there's a fall off all the way down to the black point with a massive overlap between them. And when you're adjusting gamma, you're adjusting the middle of the image with a roll off down and up either side. A huge overlap with lift, gamma, and gain. And as I said, maybe your NLE refers to this as shadows, midtones, and highlights, but it will still be exhibiting a similar amount of influence over each other, and they're deliberately broad because you want, in the early stages of manipulating contrast, you want to make broad steps to pin your blacks, pin your whites, shift the gamma, shift the midtone range, and actually shadows, midtones, and highlights specifically would, if the terminology was correct, be targeting just shadows, just midtones, and just highlights. One of the reasons why DaVinci Resolve is so useful is because it does have separate controls for lift, gamma, gain, and shadows, midtones, and highlights. So the color primaries wheels have a separate primaries and log wheels, and those different tools can target different areas. And you can even shift and adjust what defines the low range, the shadows, or the high range, the highlights, and then for everything in between as well. So zones of influence and manipulating contrast and balancing contrast is really, really important process in color. But whilst you're doing all this work, there's you again trying to link this constantly back to the biology behind this. We have to deal with the functions of our vision, and one really, really annoying but quite understandable part of our vision is something known as simultaneous contrast. And this is where the brightness or the appearance of something can be altered by its surroundings. This is actually really crucial, and something that, particularly with lockdown and people moving edit suites into their spare bedroom and so on, is something that you need to be really, really aware of. If you look at the middle grey boxes here, they appear as if the one on the left is lighter than the one on the right. And I'm sure you don't have to be a genius to figure out that's because the box on the left is surrounded by dark grey and the box on the right is surrounded by light grey. So the surroundings are directly influencing our perception of the brightness of the grey in the middle. We're all seeing that right now. It doesn't matter whether you're seeing this streamed over another part of the world or it's directly in front of you as it is here with me. We're perceiving that because of simultaneous contrast is constantly affecting our vision. Now, if you imagine that your computer display or your reference monitor, if you're set up with one at home, is that middle grey box, and the room you're in is the outer grey around it, this is why you can have a situation where you might grade something or deliver something that you viewed in a particular environment, and it be look completely different, and in this case, particularly in terms of brightness, when someone then looks back at that. And I had a conversation with someone not so long ago. They had moved their edit suite to their home, and I said, "Well, what are you doing to manage kind of color? Because I know they were color grading their own work." And they said, "Oh, it's cool. What I've done is, the room itself is quite yellow. There's a lot of bright, colorful furnishings. So I'm just blacking out the room entirely to negate that, which is good on the one hand, but it actually raises a separate issue, which is that if you're color grading in a completely blacked out space, then like on the left here, your image is going to appear much brighter. When you then deliver that and someone then looks at it in a light area, like on the right-hand side, it's going to appear quite dark. And so simultaneous contrast is why we have different standards for environments for color grading. The standard for broadcast is gamma 2.4, so your screen's set to a gamma of 2.4, which denotes the brightness of the screen, and that the ambient light in the room around you is roughly 10% of the brightness of that screen when that screen is displaying pure white. In other words, you've got roughly 100 nits of brightness on your screen and roughly 10 nits of brightness in the room around it and behind the screen. And that sort of simulates more or less the general brightness of a typical living room, a few lights on in the living room and someone sitting down and watching TV, and those kind of standards were based around that. You've got things like Gamma 2.2, which is meant to be better for online because it's slightly brighter, works better in brighter environments. But actually, if you are one of these people that has found yourself editing from home and grading from home, and you've just blacked out the space that you're in, or if in your office you always just black out your room to grade in, actually what you'll find is you're actually mimicking the way that we color grade for cinema. So of course in cinema you're sat in darkness, so it makes sense to replicate that for the grade. And so we grade with a gamma of 2.6, which is much darker, because we know it's going to be viewed in an environment which is completely blacked out. As I say, you'll have big problems if you essentially are grading with your screen set to gamma 2.4, with your environment set up as if it should be on gamma 2.6 for theatrical delivery, but actually you're grading stuff that's going out for online, which in theory which would be closer to 2.2, which is a much brighter environment. You actually got such a big discrepancy there between your environment and the viewer's environment. This function, this simultaneous contrast function of everyone's vision, is going to bite you on the bum. So you have to be quite careful. Let me just see. Sorry, I've just got a question that's just popped up. Well, actually, no, it popped up a while ago. Sorry, I didn't see it. Would you say that S-Log on Sony mirrorless cameras shouldn't be used due to the issue you just described, or are there use cases for that? Well, not all the log curves. I mean, you can shoot a log curve on a mirrorless camera that's only got 8 bits, but you need to and this is I'm going to get quite opinionated here, so do take this with a pinch of salt. This is why I really admire Canon's approach. For example, on Canon's DSLRs, they will only put Canon log in there because Canon log, the original Canon log, was always designed for an 8-bit signal. It was designed to be a gentle log curve that didn't require more than 8 bits in order to do it justice. That's why on the EOS R and the 1DX Mark III and other the 5D Mark IV, that's why you won't have access to anything other than Canon log on those cameras. If you're shooting RAW with the 1DX Mark III, then you have got more bits and you've got the ability, and that's something that in post you can then choose to change the gamma. But in the camera, you only have access to a log curve that's appropriate for it. So like the EOS R, 8-bit image, it has an 8-bit Canon log mode, and if you're exporting to something like a Ninja V, you have a 10-bit mode that you can put out there. If you look up at the cinema cameras where they can support bigger bit depths, then you have access to other log curves like Canon log 3, for example. In Sony's case, I personally, I think it's just silly that Sony put S-Log 3, which is designed for 14 plus stops of dynamic range, into a camera that's internally recording at 8-bit. It makes no sense. To my mind, it shouldn't be used. So to directly answer your question, I really think that S-Log 3 shouldn't be used in Sony's mirrorless cameras. And as a colorist, I see it all. I get given all kinds of stuff to grade, from fantastically exposed and balanced shots to things that are way off. And I have to say that I always get a sinking feeling when I get something that's been shot on, an A7S2 or something like that, internally, S-Log 3. You just know, unless they've 100% nailed their exposure, and even then, sometimes not, even if they've done that, it's going to be really difficult to grade it back because you just don't have the information there. And S-Log 3 is a gamma that's just, it's got its roots in the F55. It's not designed for a camera with such little bit depth. And I genuinely have perplexed as to why it's even in that camera, quite frankly. Anyway, I hope that answers your question. Right, balancing hue. Let's come back to our color wheel. Let's come back to our ideas of complementary colors balancing each other out. When you're balancing colors, in other words, if you've got tints, if your shadows are too blue, or if the lights you're working with are too green, the basic principle that we've already touched on about using complementary colors to neutralize, to balance out other colors, becomes incredibly important to understand. I've kind of touched on that already. Hopefully that makes enough sense for you. One thing that's not necessarily talked about, which kind of almost falls into the same thing as balancing with color, is the idea of color proportion. because of our sensitivity to certain colors, you can get away with mixing certain colors to a greater or lesser extent on screen. And I think this excites me. This is where color grading really excites me, where it links back into wardrobe and set design and art direction. Because of our responsiveness to green and red, for example, we saw that almost equal overlap between the medium and long wavelength of cones earlier. They actually can sit side by side at equals 50%, and in terms of proportion, they can fit quite well on the screen. Now, having said that, doesn't mean they necessarily work well. I was always brought up in my art education that red and green should never be seen. But if you're trying to produce a feeling of kind of opposition, it's a great combination to work with, actually. If we look at the blue and the orange beneath there, orange and teal is a classic color look, and actually this demonstrates quite nicely how. Because we're so sensitive to warm colors, and particularly colors around skin tone, which we've evolved to pay more attention to, and as I said earlier, we've evolved to pay less attention to blues. You need more blue in an image to really balance with any orange. That's if you're striving for balance. You might be striving for imbalance, in which case, the world's your oyster. But assuming we're trying to kind of create a balanced image, and particularly with orange and teal, this is why you'll often find most of the frame is actually teal, and it's just the skin and the faces which occupy physically less of the frame, which are orange, and the balance is still there. It's because actually those blues you need more blues to kind of fight and balance out with the orange. And actually the extreme of that would be something like yellow and these kind of magenta blues. As I said, magenta isn't actually a color in the spectrum of light. We're particularly weak to it. Also, cameras are particularly weak to rendering it. If you actually look at most cameras, if you look at chromaticity coordinates for Rec 709, use charts, most cameras do a pretty poor job at rendering magenta for the reasons I've just mentioned. We're quite weak to it. It's in that blue kind of part of the spectrum. It's kind of disappearing off the side there, and yellow is the opposite, and particularly tuned to that. It sits right slap bang in the middle of the overlap between all of those medium and long wavelength cones that we've got. So actually you can have a relatively small amount of yellow and it will hold its own against quite a large amount of magenta blues. Quite a useful one. I like this. And this feeds back quite nicely into my art education. I studied fine art at university, not film, and actually came into film as an extension of art, which was quite useful, I think, particularly in the color management side of things. Right, talking of which, color management. Just briefly, just wanted to talk a little bit about LUTs. It actually feeds a bit more into what we were talking about with image fidelity and bit depth and chroma subsampling and so on. This, for example, is an image from a Sony A7S. This is S-Log2, which I think is, if you expose it nicely, is usable in Sony's mirrorless cameras. This is really just the basis for us to talk about technical LUTs. To my mind, there's sort of three categories that LUTs fall into. Technical LUTs are dumb. I often refer to this SISO paradigm with technical LUTs, which makes it sound really kind of technical and high end, but it stands for shit in, shit out. I'm sorry, very naughty of me to use bad language. I apologize. But the idea being that it's dumb. It doesn't matter what you feed into it. If it's wrong, it'll come out wrong the other side. This image is a perfectly good example. If I apply a standard S-Log2 1D LUT to this, to transform this from S-Log2 to 709, it ends up being massively clipped and overexposed because, as is Sony's recommendation, this image was shot overexposed in order to deal with the weaknesses with those cameras in terms of shadow noise, picking up the noise. It's been overexposed. The LUT doesn't know that, it's not prepared for that, and so it ends up overexposed. So technical LUTs are all well and good. You just need to nail your exposure if you're going to use them, or better yet, learn how to color grade, maybe use a control panel, pin your blacks, pin your whites, shift your gamma, add some contrast. You can get there really, really quickly if you know what you're doing, and you don't need to use a technical LUT. Technical LUTs, I think, are very useful if you're trying to do color space transforms, but don't put huge amounts of faith in technical LUTs if you're shooting with lower end cameras on lower end productions. we're kind of fed this lie that they're necessary. I can assure you they're not. I think probably I use technical LUTs probably 10% of the time that I'm color grading. And they don't necessarily take longer either. It was last year, I did an Instagram story just for a laugh where I had a race with myself. I had a shot, an image that was provided by a client that was shot on a Blackmagic camera, and I recorded myself how long it took me to right-click on the node and go and find the appropriate LUT to apply it, and then took a screen grab of the final image and displayed it, and it took about 20 seconds. And then I reset and did the whole thing again, but just did it from scratch, just forgetting the LUT and just manually balancing it. And not only does the final image look much, much better because it was based on the image in front of me, not with my eyes closed, which is essentially what the technical LUT's doing. It actually took the same length of time. They both took 20 seconds. So it's something to bear in mind with technical LUTs anyway. Now, the other category that kind of falls in with technical LUTs, and I think kind of bridges actually between technical and creative LUTs, custom LUTs. You may not have ever done this. They're actually
Ollie.
really, really easy.
Ollie, 2 seconds. The feed's quite pixelated. I'm just going to change servers quickly. 2 seconds.
Oh, okay, mate. Okay. Whilst you're doing that, Jake, but there's a question from Ben McGeorge Henderson. How do you find the 10-bit 42 from the Panasonic S1 Vlog? I know S1 is Netflix certified, but would you be happy with regular S1 footage for UK broadcast? I think you've answered your own question there. Really, the Vlog. I actually found that Vlog was really, really bad when it first started appearing with whatever it was, the GH5. I think was the first camera that implemented it. But actually, as the cameras have kind of moved on and they've been developed, I actually find that those 10-bit files, the 42 files, perfectly fine. It really, you've got to look beyond the numbers, Ben, because it's in itself 10-bit 42 Vlog. Even things like Netflix certified. It's all meaningless if you put it in the hands of someone who doesn't know what they're doing and doesn't expose correctly. It's really a pain to kind of correct it. I have a C200, and I know loads of people that bemoan the MP4, the 8-bit from that camera, and the fact that there's not an internal 10-bit codec. It's nonsense. If you shoot things correctly, it doesn't matter if it's even 8-bit. If you shoot things well, expose correctly, and give yourself as little to do in post as possible, then everything can look right. So it's kind of irrelevant whether it's 10-bit 42 or anything else. It's more about how it's been shot. Of course, at the upper end of our industry, you've got both nailing it in camera, nailing it with lighting, fantastic operators, and fantastic codecs and cameras, and you just kind of got everything working for you. So at that level, it's relatively easy, I have to say. Technical LUTs are quite useful in monitoring the image. Yeah, so Martin, so you're talking about technical LUTs for monitoring the image. That's actually what I was just coming on to. So technical LUTs, if you're monitoring with a technical LUT, then it's kind of taken a little bit of the guesswork out, because whilst you were exposing, you were seeing that LUT applied anyway. So it's no surprise that then it should work when you get to the other end, because it was what you were seeing. You would have to have exposed it and then looked at it and gone, oh, well, that looks wrong, but it must be right for it to not work. This is where custom LUTs come in, because with custom LUTs, you can see here, for example, with the chart, you can take a reference image, ideally with some kind of chart. You can then balance that. And you can literally, I've done this time and time again, where you just do this quickly with a laptop on location or on set. And then you actually produce a custom technical LUT, so based on your actual scene and your actual camera and your actual exposure, and you can just right-click, export that LUT straight out of Resolve, and just take that cube file and slap it straight on your monitors, on the camera, however you want to do it. You can even, and this is where I sort of say they kind of bridge between technical and creative, you can even deliberately maybe start to push in some of the creative looks. So obviously on big shows, they actually do quite a lot of pre visualization and creating custom show LUTs, where they're actually doing proper tests lighting tests, and they're bringing that all together and actually pushing some of the look in as well. So you're not just monitoring the neutralized image, you're actually monitoring with some of the look on there as well, which is obviously hugely valuable. And you're absolutely right, Martin. It's very useful to be able to do that. But it actually depends on how you work. I have to say, whenever I'm shooting, I never use any display LUTs at all. My eyes are just glued to the waveform monitor. I'm really not too concerned about the way it looks on the screen. But then maybe that's because I don't tend to have clients peering over my shoulder.
Ollie, can you quickly just hop into Discord and toggle back to 720, then back to 1080 for the stream to see if that resets it?
Yes, mate.
Cool.
Let me open it up. 720, and then go back into 1080.
Yeah, it's still quite.
How's that?
It's still pretty compressed. Give me 2 seconds. It looks so much better in Brazil. Switch back
in Brazil.
Where the servers now, we are now routing to Brazil. So let's just see if that makes a difference. Let me go back to Europe now.
Done. Thank you. Right.
All right, there we go. Perfect, mate. Looks good. Crack on. All good.
Cool. Okay, so there's your custom LUTs. And then, of course, you have your creative LUTs. One of the things to be careful of with your creative LUTs is some creative LUTs actually come and they've already got the transform, the gamut or gamma transform for a given source already as part of the creative LUT. So it's kind of got the look and the transform all together. I've known people who have applied a creative LUT on top of a technical LUT, and then essentially you end up with a double transform taking place, and it goes hideously wrong. So do be careful there. But what we're talking about here is we're talking about mechanisms to either move our image from one space to another, from one color gamut to another, or from one gamma to another, and or a creative one that's moving the image to a creative look. That might be. Are they necessary? Not all the time. Not necessarily. As I said, there's more often than not when I'm grading, I'm not using any LUTs at all. It just depends on your approach and what you're doing. It depends on the production as well. But don't. I guess the kind of the highlight here is just don't be a slave to LUTs. Don't panic about them. Don't think that they are literally the only way that you can kind of get somewhere with imaging. The amount of times I've just taken the raw image and I'm literally just developing it from scratch. If you're going round in circles with LUTs, just turn them all off and just use common sense. Pin your black point, pin your white point, apply an S curve. You'll be amazed how far you get that stuff without having to worry too much. Right. Okay. Another question. I'll just do a few questions because we kind of veer off in another direction here. So I'm personally a big fan of false color. So if I were to use that on log, I'd have to recalibrate the false color. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, false color is all right. The thing that you can also do, Martin, which actually works really well. I've demonstrated probably in another talk on with CVP before actually. Is which isn't just for false color, it would be actually for anything, whether you're using zebras or waveforms or anything, is actually just if you're in a controlled environment, or even if you're not, to be honest, you can just put your camera into Rec 709, expose, and you can use your false color if you want. You can use whatever technique you usually use, whatever you're comfortable with, make sure that image looks exactly how you want it, and then change your gamma afterwards. It's quite often I hear people struggling with exposing for log curves, for example. There's nothing. It's not going to make any difference to your exposure changing your gamma. Materially, it looks like it does. Obviously, the white points drop and the black points go up, but that doesn't mean you've changed your foundation exposure. If you've exposed correctly in Rec 709, and if that means being in Rec 709 whilst you've got false color on, then fine. Once you're happy, if you then change the gamma, the image is still correct. it doesn't change. So I do often see people struggling with this, and they've gone into the log gamma first, and then they're like, all right, well, now how do I expose? Everything's not where I'm expecting it to be. There's literally no reason why you can't do it whilst you're still in Rec 7 and 9 and then change afterwards. It works perfectly well. Right. All of this is obviously quite technical. One of the things I absolutely love about color grading and why I became a colorist in the first place is I just love the fact that it's half technical know-how and half technical consideration and half creative endeavor. I absolutely love that mix between the technical and the creative. I know some people hate it. That's absolutely fine. But I'm really, really comfortable in that. And I've kind of covered off the technical, if you like, and some of the things that it's really important to understand about the way that we're shooting and everything we've talked about and the way the eyes work. But here now, I just wanted to finish up by kind of connecting that with the creative, the final thing that we're creating, and some of the huge amounts of value that can be added with color, and applying these sort of simple color theory steps beforehand. The key thing for me, and if you remember nothing else about this talk, the key thing for me is that if you really understand these technical underpinnings and really understand how to get the best out of your camera and best out of your lighting and your scene and everything to do with your image, it means that when you get to post-production, you have all the time in the world to think about the types of things we're going to talk about here now. The supporting your narrative, the telling a story with color and contrast. You have all the time you need to do that instead of 10% of the time, because the other 90% was spent, putting out fires, dealing with noise, dealing with badly exposed images, dealing with color tints, dealing with all these other things, wondering why you can't get the best image out of an A7S II that you've shot something with and you've stuck it in S-Log3 and someone told you that that's the best thing to do because it makes it easier to grade. If I had a pound for every time I heard someone say, oh, I've shot it in S-Log3 on my A7S II because it makes it easier to grade, which is the most nonsensical comment I've ever heard. It doesn't make it easier to grade, it makes it an absolute nightmare to grade. If we understand all of these things and we really kind of get a handle on them, then you can spend all of your time in post in the color suite really thinking about these types of things that I'm going to talk about, which for me are just the most exciting thing about color grading. So there's 4 different films I'm just going to kind of run through very quickly. Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy is one that I've been sort of talking about for years. I just think it's fantastic the way that they approach color and contrast. First thing to talk about with this film is that the contrast look for the whole thing goes completely against the kind of the expected. It's very low contrast, which is brave because it's actually biologically measurable that we have a pleasure response based on high contrast imagery. You can literally put like probes on people's heads and you can measure the alpha waves, and people have a positive reaction to high contrast imagery. And they think that's because our eyes are permanently looking for areas of high contrast to both do that kind of internal white balance mechanism, which I talked about earlier, but also to judge how sharp our vision is and how in focus our vision is, which, as you can imagine, is quite important at a biological level. Our brain's actually permanently looking for areas of high contrast and drawn to them first. And it's kind of almost, it's checking things, checking focus, checking how good our vision is. So there's actually a measurable positive response that we have emotionally to high contrast images. If you walk down the magazine aisle, in a supermarket or at W.H. Smith's or something like that, if you look, every single cover of those magazines will be glossy, accentuating and deepening the blacks, making high contrast images look even more contrasty. They pop, they have a clarity that we find appealing. To go against that, to deliberately grade a film so it's low contrast, the elevated blacks, compressed highlights, is quite a brave step, and I think it works really nicely in this film. I have a bit of an issue with it when people just do it arbitrarily, just because for the sake of the look of it. I'd say that extends to actually to any arbitrary look that gets put on anything really, without thinking about how it's affecting the narrative. I think this film does a really good job of demonstrating where and when something low contrast could really work, because what it does is it creates a very faded, it's a period film for a start, but it's a very faded image. It's lacking clarity, which if you've seen the film, you'll know it's about, it's essentially a whodunit. It's about finding a mole within MI6. And the whole film has a lack of clarity to it. It's not until the final scene that we find out who the mole is. And so I think the lack of contrast, the lack of a defining edge anywhere, it gives a kind of a murky, dirty, kind of fogginess to it, which I think really lends itself to the narrative. It's a really nice film in as much as it's not patronizing to the audience. It doesn't give little clues, doesn't leave breadcrumbs for you to kind of go, oh, that was, I think I knew it was going to be them. It actually does the opposite. It does everything it can to make you never really consider too strongly one person or another. The other cool thing it does, so that's kind of contrast. The other cool thing it does is the color palette, which is both a reflection of the period. So it's got these kind of browny oranges and these tealy blues that use really effectively as part of kind of the conveyance of the period. But it also does it as a wonderful way of balancing out the image and framing the characters. The characters themselves never really wear strong colors. They never really use the colors of the palette on the characters themselves and the actors themselves. The wardrobe's incredibly low saturation. It's kind of mundane. They're very low contrast even, just like we've got here. And it kind of, again, it supports the fogginess that you have, this lack of clarity about the people themselves. And these teals and oranges are used all the way through the film in the set design. They're often used to kind of draw and frame characters quite nicely. There's a really nice one. There's a really nice one where they're on the bed here, where the bedspread is this color. Now, maybe this is purely through the set design. Maybe this has been supported through the color grade. But this is exactly that same sort of brown, umbery orange that has been established already as part of the palette for the film. And it's really used nicely to kind of support the framing of the characters, because the characters themselves, as I said, are really low contrast, really low saturation, blacks, grays. There's no strong colors with the actual wardrobe, and the characters themselves, they're using the set design, they're using the props to actually do that job for them. And I think this is just such a lovely way of framing this image. And it's used a lot. It's used a lot throughout the whole film. Finally, this is one of my kind of like favorite images to dissect. Here they're doing two things. Again, if we start thinking about the contrast, you'll notice that the people themselves, all the actors, are very low contrast still, even though that the space that they're in is actually a relatively high contrast scene. The objects on the table, the shadows under the table, they're all relatively high contrast. And particularly as you get to the edge of the frame, the shadows in the lower left and lower right corners, that it's a relatively high contrast image, but the people themselves have been maintained as low contrast. And this is quite a crucial scene as well, because you've got John Hurt in the middle. He's the one who's in charge. He's tasked Gary Oldman with finding the mole. They think it's one of these four people: Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, or Spy. So it's a really crucial scene. And not least because it's taking place in a soundproofed room. They're not. They're in a space which is designed to keep secrets, and of course we know that there's someone there keeping secrets. And I love the way that this plays on the old saying of the walls have ears. Essentially, these walls, which are designed to keep secrets and keep people from hearing the truth, may well have heard the truth or know something, but be impossible for the walls to reveal that, because it's a wall. And to help support that idea, this soundproofing on the wall, it's given that same color. This orange, this warm flesh-like orange, you can see on the vectorscope, it's actually heading up the flesh tone line. It's literally personifying the only object in the room that can't talk to us or tell us the truth. And by doing that, it contrasts with the depersonification and the kind of the smokiness that we have with the actual people whose job it is to keep secrets. Really lovely use of contrast and color in that film. I think it's great. I also love this film, Whiplash. Some of you may have seen me do a breakdown of this film before. It's just absolutely outstanding. The Damien Chazelle is just an amazing director, and his approach to the use of color, I think, is just incredible. So the whole of the beginning part of this film, before we really find out about the true dynamic between the student and the teacher, the beginning of the film, it has a very sort of restrained color palette. And crucially, skin tones look normal. There's no reason to suspect that anything's kind of untoward. And the whole of the opening scenes, people are wearing a lot of whites and greys, because if something's neutral, like this guy's grey top, because of simultaneous contrast, because of our appreciation for objects based on their surroundings, if your surroundings are neutral, then things that are of color, so skin or a colored stripy top, it helps those things stand out and it helps you appreciate them in isolation. So using these grays, it reaffirms the neutrality and the normalness of the beginning of the film, and then as soon as color is used, it then makes it even more pronounced. So for example, here when we meet the father, we realize that there's this whole thing where the main character is seeking approval from his father for his kind of career decisions and what he wants to do, playing music, being in a jazz band, being a drummer, and the awful kind of relationship that he has with his dad who doesn't think that that's worthwhile, and using this quite frankly disgusting green in the shirt of his dad, which becomes a recurring theme. And also look at the skin. Let's just go back. We've got these kind of relatively low saturated, normal looking skin tones. We're actually starting to amp up these sort of these oranges, which are used throughout the film as the relationship develops with his teacher, and we know more about that. It starts to go up and up. Now look at the green shirt on the dad. He's a threat in a way. He doesn't believe that he's got what it takes to do the career he wants. The following scene, we have the main character trying to win the position of the drummer in the jazz band, and the guy that's currently the drummer in the jazz band, oh look, he's got exactly the same color shirt on. He is also an obstacle to him progressing his career, and it's the only strong color there. These things aren't incidental. It's the only strong color that's in that shot. Notice that the skin tones are starting to warm up again. It's very, very similar to this shot here, and in turn very different to here where we started. And as we start to progress and we start to realize that this kind of seeking approval from a father figure, he kind of transfers that onto the teacher, and the teacher's kind of trying to seduce him, trying to sort of give him this kind of dangle this carrot that you might be great, and the acting in this shot's fantastic. The kind of predatory nature of the teacher, trying to sort of seduce his ego, and then it all turns on the next scene where in front of the whole class he starts slapping him when he can't quite get the beat right. The kind of abusive relationship element and the toxicity between in that relationship becomes more and more evident, and green and orange become the theme. So pushing green into skin, and it's very disgusting, lurid green as well. This scene is where he's just had an accident. There's blood all over the drum kit. It's quite dramatic. He's kind of in this car crash. They're using these greeny cyan colors, pushing them into skin tones, which traditionally you would only do for like a corpse or in makeup for feature. They push a lot of cyan into like zombies, and in special effects makeup, it's actually considered kind of to be associated with unhealthy skin tones. So it's literally an illness, which is a really nice way of making us feel like there's a sickness here, and then is at odds with these scenes where he feels like he's rid of that teacher and things go back to normal. Skin tones start to look normal again, and that sets us up really nicely for the end of the film, where the teacher tries to get his revenge, and pulls this kind of this trick. He sort of tries to land him in it. And then the final part of the film, actually, these oranges, these kind of threatening oranges, morph into these golden hues. And there's this wonderfully complex dynamic at the end where he turns the tables again, and he actually kind of forces the agenda live on stage. And the teacher kind of responds to it. And there's this look of almost like he was doing everything he did for this moment. And there's this kind of sickening look of approval, or seeking approval on the main character's face at the end. But the golden hues here, it becomes very different. It's more like they've met this equilibrium. It's no longer this kind of abusive threat. It's more of like, have I proved myself, which is kind of sad in many ways. The other thing, and a big tip I would give to anyone who's kind of trying to break down color looks and trying to like develop their own color palette for their films, is look at other things associated with it. So don't forget, we live in a visual world. It's very easy for us to become egotistical and think video and film is it. There's a whole world of imagery, from photography to graphics, motion graphics, illustration. All of these things are trying to tell the same stories using often more limited palettes. So looking at posters, for example, or cover artwork for films, I think is incredibly valuable, because you're essentially looking at into the mind of a graphic designer or an illustrator who is trying to tell a similar story to you, but without the benefit of motion and of dialogue. And so they're really stripped back to just color, and they're stripped back to just graphics. And I think it's a really useful way to get to the crux of a kind of a narrative with something. And I think it's very telling, the orange that's used in the poster and on the DVD artwork for this film. It's almost exactly the same orange as these irritant and bleach warning symbols, and I'm sure there's something in that toxicity, that toxic relationship between him and the teacher and the father. It's a really interesting thing to consider when you're looking at breaking down films. Blade Runner 2049, another really interesting film, use of color. The whole opening scene plays on this idea of the outside world being somewhere dangerous, and inside this replicant's house. Spoiler alert, by the way, everyone. I'm presuming it's obvious, but anyway. The idea that this replicant's home is so sort of desaturated, it's kind of mundane. Its domesticity is so obvious in the way that it's just so simple. And I love the fact that this yellow is used in these kind of vestibule areas. It's almost like a decompression chamber between the outside world and the inside. And I was really lucky. I got to speak to Roger Deakins last year, and was asking him about these scenes. And he said that this yellow, when he was out, I think they were out on a recce with the director, and they found, I think they were in Spain. I can't remember exactly what he said, but they found this yellow. They saw this yellow, and he was like, that's the yellow that we need. And it's really used, interestingly, here as this kind of buffer between the outside world and the inside world. The outside world being incredibly neon and vibrant and kind of almost dangerous in its intensity, which plays against this very simple inside this domestic setting here, which I think it makes this scene really so powerful, because it's kind of sad. You've got this big, huge, the casting plays an important part, so this big, huge guy, Dave Bautista, and you've got this huge amount of power that's there, but all he wants is just to spend a day working and then come home and eat his dinner. There's no color, almost complete absence of color. It's kind of banal. And what they're using contrast to really frame the characters, which is really nice with the composition and the use of contrast. And they're using simple splashes of color to tell a lot. So the yellow in the kind of the vestibule area, and then this blue, which is just reinforcing, along with the obviously the depth of field, reinforcing he's just come home from a day's work and his dinner's on the oven. That beautifully sets up the extreme explosive violence that happens after this, where you have to. It seems like he has to deal with this replicant, and it also is kind of mimicked to a certain extent with the palette, the very soft pastels, low saturation palette that's used in the home setting of Ryan Gosling, of course, who himself is a replicant. So it's kind of playing on the same idea that this is just normality. These people are essentially humans. Why don't they have the right to kind of live, in inverted commas? And then it reserves these strong yellows for kind of these external forces, these threats that are coming from outside, which are used so effectively. And I think also the other key color is when we move into the scenes where he's moving through like the sand dunes and he finds Harrison Ford, where these yellows very, very gently move across more into oranges, and they're more kind of skin colored. They're more human, they're warmer. And I think that human versus inhuman is obviously such an important theme, and I think it's important that relationship is built up there with Harrison Ford. It's a more of a fatherly kind of relationship. It's more of a kind of a paternal, protective thing. So I think those warm colors are quite important, the way that they move across there. Lastly, the crown. The reason I've got the crown in here is I think it's an absolute masterclass in how the hell you can make something look interesting with a deep depth of field and large spaces. I think most of us, if we hold our hands up, know that if we want to make something cinematic, let's open up the aperture and let's get in close, long lens, get that lovely shallow depth of field, big bokeh, wow, there you go, there's your cinematic look. It's bloody hard to make something look attractive on a large, wide angle, deep depth of field scale. Very, very hard. And the wider that lens, the more money has to be spent on production design, the more that everything in that frame has to work, the deep depth of field as well. And what they do so effectively on the Crown is they take these large spaces where you can see everything, and they use repetition, they use symmetry, they use lines, and they almost always terminate in these bright areas of clipped, well, not clipped, but like detail-less areas of highlight at the far end of the room. So it's drawing your eye through the space, and it works really, really well. So they're kind of essentially cutting spaces up, segmenting spaces, or terminating spaces with these bright areas of highlights, which you never see details in. There's always a nice color glow to them, even in HDR. There's this nice kind of colorful glow to them, but you don't see anything outside those windows, which I think really reinforces the isolation of what's happening inside the palace from what's happening outside the palace. And you see it time and time again throughout the whole series. It's a really lovely way of framing characters, framing spaces. But I think if we're all honest, how comfortable would you be being DOP on something like this? The huge size of the spaces, the lack of the depth of field that you have to try and achieve with these as well. It's just a masterclass in lighting. It really is. The other thing is obviously the color palette, both in terms of kind of period, but how they're treating that in terms of desaturating spaces for certain time periods, certain things that are happening at that time as well. And there's one right at the end here, which is a really nice use of color balance. Look again, these clipped, there's color in these highlights. They're not just clipped windows. They're using these as color. They're using these for balance, yellow and blue. Remember, complementary colors. They're using it to add balance to the image. And there's a really nice one at the end, which again plays on this symmetry of the frame and balancing that with the yellows and the blues. So, really thinking about how color can add balance. Those color proportion things that I was talking about earlier, all plays together. All starts from a solid technical understanding and then feeding that into the kind of the creative understanding that comes after that. Right. 90 minutes non-stop. I didn't even breathe once. I don't know if you noticed. But I think let's go and see what questions we've got in Discord. Martin. Sorry, Martin, I lost you halfway through. Let's have a look. Wrong way. You can get, yeah. Kind of things. One thing to note is probably the collaboration between the art department. Oh yeah, absolutely. The collaboration between the art department, set design, costume, DP, director. You miss director out of that. That's where it starts and finishes really. And the colorist. It's great as a colorist if you get the opportunity to be brought in pre-production and work with the art department, work with the DP, work with the director. It makes such a huge difference. It's very hard to achieve a nice color palette if you don't have the great collaboration yet. I feel like a lot of new producers underestimate the need for that. Martin, that in a nutshell, that one sentence is exactly why I do 90% of the training that I do. You're absolutely right. I think a lot of people, and not even new producers, people who've been at it a while, I think lack of budget doesn't excuse a lack of communication. You don't have to have a big budget to discuss goals in terms of wardrobe and art design, art department and set design. You can communicate all the things, you can pre-plan all these things. The worst thing you can do is not spend a single second thinking about it, capture everything, edit everything, get to the grade and go, right, what look do we want? I think you've just lost as soon as you get to that stage. You certainly aren't going to produce something as effective as it could have been. And as I said just a moment ago, if you understand all the technical underpinnings of everything, everything that's going on in imaging and how the human visual system works, how you're exposing and monitoring and all these other sorts of things, it frees you up when you get to this part of the post-production stage to and hopefully in communication with all these other different departments, it frees you up to really drill home this idea of the color and the contrast being an extra narrative element. In all of those films I've just shown you, color is as important as anything else. It's not an afterthought, and it's just so important. It really, really is. Great. Okay, Jake, I think I've got to the end of any questions on Discord. Are there any from YouTube that haven't made their way across yet, or anything?
No, that's everything at the moment, mate. Yeah.
Okay. Less questions.
Oh, here we go. What's your thoughts on working in data levels versus video levels now there are more cameras that support it?
Sorry, just repeat that question again, mate, for me.
What's your thoughts on working in data levels versus video levels now that there are more cameras that support it?
So I'm increasingly shooting more and more RAW. I think as card speeds and storage are getting cheaper, there's more occasions I'm shooting RAW. And of course, with RAW, you've got the ability to go wherever you want with that. I think that ultimately it comes down, although you're right, there are more and more cameras that are working that way. It's ultimately about the display, and it's about the viewing end of things. You having a camera that's capable and monitoring color management pipeline set up your end is fine, but if ultimately it's being viewed by someone on a device that's not capable of having those those full ranges represented correctly, then it's for nothing. And it's unfortunately that's what's kind of keeping us in a bit of a bubble, because it's constantly kind of, but how can people view this? There are still things about the way that Rec 709 is set up that go back, in broadcast levels that go back to cathode ray tubes and protecting viewers who are sat there with CRT TVs so that they don't blow up if you send them more than a volt of transmission. There are things that we're still kind of tiptoeing around because of display technology that's long since gone, or we imagine is long since gone. But you always have to kind of play to the lowest common denominator, which is a real shame, and it does hamper sort of that side of development to a certain extent. So it's right that we've got much wider not just data levels in terms of contrast, but gamuts as well. And they're out there, the displays that can show these. I think pretty much all of Apple's displays on their computers and monitors, laptops, phones, iPads. They're all P3 now, I believe. I'm right in saying most of them can achieve about 500 or 600 nits as well. So we're getting there. But you need to have that fully sewn up end to end. Or be in a closed viewing environment to fully take advantage of it. Please explain a bit more in terms of creating an ideal environment, online content versus simulating. Yeah, so KK19, creating an ideal color grading environment for online content means, as you said, ideal. I'll tell you ideal, but obviously you're going to have to work within the limitations of your space. So it's about making sure that the area around the monitor that you're viewing is controlled both in terms of color and in terms of uniformity and in terms of brightness. The brightness thing I talked about already with the simultaneous contrast. So in for broadcast spec, you'd have your screen gamma 2.4, and the illumination of the room and therefore behind the screen would be at 10 nits, would be at 10% of that value. For online, you could argue then that you should be at a gamma 2.2, and then that should be a slightly brighter ambience, around about sort of 12 to 15 nits ambient brightness in the room. I don't know many people that kind of really bother with that. It's probably just worth kind of just checking your stuff looks all right, with the curtains up and letting a bit more light into your space, just making sure it's not looking too dark. But there are some people I know that only grade online content, will only grade it at gamma 2.2. But generally speaking, you will be working to the kind of Rec 709 standards of 2.4. So you want that uniformity behind the screen. Color-wise, you want it to be neutral, so you can't have any bright colors. Vivid colors behind the screen. They'll tint your vision. They'll ruin everything that you grade. We use a specialist paint from GTI, which is a spectrally flat color sweep paint. I think we use N7 or N8. I can't remember which one we use. It's about 150 quid for quite a small tin, but it's very thin. It goes a long way. Our whole suite here is painted with that on the walls. And that means that there's no pigment in it. So as the light hits it, it's not tinting our color vision. We use bias lighting behind our client reference monitor, so that basically gives like an illumination behind the screen. So it creates a flat illumination that we can control. It dims behind the client screen. And the other important thing is that all of your light sources in that space need to be the same white point as the white point of your screen. And so screens have a white point of 6,500 Kelvin. So your lighting in your space should also be 6,500 Kelvin. Yeah, so that's the ideal. How much of that you can achieve is up to you. Thank you so much. You're welcome. Footy check. Edge of Europe on the west coast of Ireland. I was thinking of moving to a different city to improve my career. Which city in the world would be the best to move to for the film scene? Footy check. Where should you move? I feel like that's a huge amount of responsibility. What if I just want to have a little bit of a joke with you and I say, move to Greenland? I don't want you to take this as read. I don't want this to dictate your future path. But I think it's pretty obvious that places like London, LA, Paris, Berlin, any of the big capital cities in Europe, obviously being English, I would probably plumb with the UK. I mean, London you can't avoid the fact that there's been in the news a lot over the last 6 months. There's a lot of money from big studios being plumbed into the UK and particularly London. Northern Ireland's a great hotspot for production as well.
Bristol.
So yeah, there's a lot to choose from.
Yeah.
I don't actually live in London. I didn't want to live in London. I grew up in New Forest, so I wanted to stay a bit more in the countryside. So I'm based in Somerset, but I'm only an hour and a half away from London. I'm in London all the time, but I'm sure you could make it work from the west coast of Ireland if you really wanted to. Question from Alex: could you describe a bit about pinning black and pinning white? So Alex, the general concept being that if you have something that is actually black in your image, then you find that in your scopes and you lower your lift until that point is just above 0 IRE. And if you have something that should be white, and in this case, what I would define by white, assuming we're talking about traditional Rec 709 here, is something that would sit at 100 IRE, so the top of your waveform, and that should be something that is a bright diffuse white. So that would have to be something like a fluffy white cloud, or something that is naturally bright. In theory, in Rec 709, that the area between sort of 90 IRE and 100 is kind of reserved for brighter sort of specular highlights, and sort of 90 would be like something like a white piece of paper. If you don't have a scene with those things in it, it obviously becomes harder. If there's nothing true black and nothing true white, it obviously becomes a little bit more difficult. The key thing to get right there is to not arbitrarily bring the darkest thing in your scene down to 0 IRE. I see people do that an awful lot. There's something that, it's got detail in it that really in the real world was about 20 or 30 IRE, but because it happens to be the darkest thing in their scene, they just arbitrarily pull it down to 0. And the same thing at the other end in the highlights. It's important that you don't do that. You have to be realistic. To help you can use charts. So I use charts an awful lot. They have glossy black and 90% reflectance white value references on them. And it means that it doesn't matter what's in my scene, I have a reference that I can then balance and pin my black and white to. So that can help a lot. Could you talk a bit about when grading documentaries with very different footage in terms of color profile, looks, etc.? Fandy, yeah, I do a lot of kind of brand documentary work, and I have produced a 25-minute documentary series before, and I know it's difficult. It's not just the reserve of documentaries. Anything really can go wrong when you start mixing different footage, different cameras. Charts are very, very useful if you have control. I did a training series two years ago, crocky, called Mastering Color, and completely against our plans, just due to circumstances. We had a bit of a problem. We had to kind of think on our feet on the day. We ended up shooting for 3 solid days. And I mean solid. We were literally shooting from 9 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock in the afternoon. 4 cameras? No, 3 cameras. Yeah, 3 cameras. No, it was 4 cameras. I think it was. Anyway, we didn't intend it to be, but we ended up with our A cam being an FS7. B cam was A cam was a C200. B cam was an FS7, and we had an FS5, and I think we had a mirrorless something or other in there as well. And it wasn't the original intention, but there we were. And I had 3 days worth of rushes and a deliverable that was about 9.5 hours long that constantly multicam cut back and forth between those 4 different cameras. And we just kept showing our X-Rite color checker chart to each of the cameras all the time, like literally every half an hour throughout the day. And if we hadn't have done that, it would have been an absolute nightmare. It was difficult enough as it was, but when you're matching color profiles with footage, it's so helpful to have a reference, a consistent reference like a chart. If you don't have that, you just have to find similar features that appear in those shots, interrogate them under your scopes, find out where they are, make sure that they match from shot to shot. But I'm not going to lie to you, it's the most time-consuming and tricky part of color grading, that continuity, and it's the least sexy part of it, the part that people talk about least often. You go on YouTube and look for color grading tutorials about creating creative looks. They're absolutely everywhere. Every man and his dog will tell you how to do this look or that look. You try and find one telling you just how to match continuity between shots. Yeah, it takes real skill, real effort, real experience, and it's bloody hard. So yeah, not an easy solution, I'm afraid. It takes a lot of practice, but it's something that I tackle in my Mastering Color course. There's a chapter about matching cameras and continuity, which I do with the cameras that we're shooting with, and it becomes all a little bit meta, but it's quite a fun one to look at. Another question: false color. What's the most common mistake DPs make when shooting that makes your... Oh, I see, their name is false color. Okay. That confused me. What's the most common mistake DPs make when shooting that makes your job harder? The classic one, it happens far too often, is people shooting, and it seems to always be people shooting with Sonys as well. And that's not just me as a Canon user trying to be causing problems. Genuinely, I seem to get loads of FS7 and A7S2 operators who send us stuff, and they're trying their best with the cameras. They're trying to overexpose like Sony tell them to, but particularly with the mirrorless cameras, they're overexposing. They're using things like S-Log3, in a camera that's recording 8-bit 420, and it there's no two ways about it. It makes our job as colorists really, really tricky when you've got thin codec with an image that's prone to noise, that they're trying to deal with that noise by overexposing it. It's all bets are off. Forget trying to use a LUT. You're absolutely running on your instincts, and you're just praying to God that you get the image back to where it should be before it falls to pieces. And it's really, really not fun. Yeah, that makes life really hard. I touched on it already. The irony is that these cameras, these cheaper cameras and mirrorless cameras, they're the hardest cameras to get right. It's really difficult, even for very experienced DPs, to get just the right image out of those cameras. And yet they're being the cheaper cameras. They're the ones that are in the hands of the least experienced people. The irony being, at the higher end of our industry, the cameras that cost a fortune, they're the easiest to operate. They're the easiest to get a good image from, and they've got so much latitude that you can be really far off the mark, and they can be pulled back really easily. It's crazy. It's a shame it's that way around, but there you go. That's the nature of the beast. Right. I feel like we've reached a natural conclusion. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you, Jake, for hosting me.
No worries.
And yeah, if any other questions come up, then drop me a line. Oh, in fact, on the screen there's a Facebook group called Coro Alumni. If anyone's on Facebook and wants to join that group, it's a good place to post any questions if anything crops up afterwards, or you can stick them in Discord or YouTube, and we'll try and get to them.
Awesome. Thank you, man.
Thank you, Jake.
All right. Have a good weekend.
You too, buddy.
All
Enjoy it, everyone.
Cheers.